Philosophers in space.
Welcome back to the show, my friends. I am your captain, Callie Wright, joined as always by the best chief ethics officer in the business, Aaron. How are you, my friend?
You know, feeling vaguely ethical, I guess. Pseudo-ethical.
just vaguely ethical.
Pseudo-podily ethical, I suppose.
Oh, yeah, this has been a hell of a ride. One of the reasons that I am deeply grateful that you asked me to co-host the show is because it has been opening my world to so much cool stuff that I probably wouldn't have had the thought to get into before. Like, it would have been a thing where I'm like, oh, you told me about that story and that sounds pretty rad. I'll check that out at some point. Never actually do that. But now it's like,
harder.
Got to do it for the content, right?
Yeah, now you got a really, really big reading group to not let down.
Yeah.
But it goes both ways, Callie, absolutely, because, you know, I'm feeling a little punch drunk still, literally, because we just did a NASA that was easily one of my favorite NASAs of all time, and that was a suggestion by you to do the movie Robot Jocks, which I had never seen, but apparently a bunch of other people had watched while I was watching Transformers, the animated movie. And
which, like, never a bad choice.
No, still not. It aged beautifully, in my opinion, like a fine wine. But no, this was an amazing choice. We had a lot of fun, and apparently, according to one of our longtime top patrons, Testimony of Mushrooms, they pointed out that I mixed up Luke Cage and Johnny Cage at one point. I'm not going to explain how or why. You got to go listen to the show to find out. But it's maybe the best name mix-up I've ever accomplished. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say, like, in your defense, I heard all the words you were saying, and it didn't dawn on me. And so, like, I'm just as culpable. So, like, I can't make fun of you too hard about it.
I've infected you to the point now where you just translate it. That's the problem.
Oh God. Well, do we have any housekeeping, or is it time to just do the thing?
I think, honestly, joxing it was the only housekeeping I had. You know, our patron drive continues apace.
So where we left off before was at the point that our intrepid cephalopods, is the sea a hard sea? Is it?
Oh, I believe if they say it, it's a hard C, but you probably shouldn't, because that would be inappropriate.
Oh my God.
Oh, sorry. Is that too weird for After Dark? Not After Dark?
Our intrepid, angsty, tentacly friends had been forced to leave their planet because it had been infested by the creature from Nod, which is this very fun collective consciousness that infects everything around and absorbs itself into its being. And they had to essentially just cut themselves off from the planet. They had built these orbital habitats and ships and stuff, and a bunch of people were living in space to ameliorate population problems. And when they realized what was happening, they made the really hard decision and just like cut all of the orbital tethers and said, like, sorry, everybody below on the planet, you're boned. We're going to go do our thing. So, yeah.
And I wanted to clarify, I think last time I wasn't clear. I wasn't sure on whether the creature from Nod ever like successfully assimilated the Octos, and it didn't. I think what we find out is that, like, by the end of this book, it hasn't done so yet. But it's something that's
it has.
It hasn't in the like epilogue-y thing, kind of, right? But
yeah, because there's a bit in the epilogue where the creature is talking and it speaks of itself as being partially Salome. Which is one of our octopus friends, and so
one of our octo friends, yes.
Yeah.
So how do we get there, though? Right? How do we get from blowing up skyhooks to that?
Yeah. So there's some exploration happening, right? And and I'm actually having trouble remembering where exactly they meet, because basically the humans, like the human Portiid alliance, becomes aware that the creature from Nod is a thing, and they learn to be very, very scared of it because it definitely can destroy them. And actually, speaking of plot points, things that we really want to talk about, we get such a wonderful description of like the internal life of the creature of Nod in this section of the book, where it is. I think the most like viscerally horrifying thing about it is its indifference to like the horrible thing that it presents for like someone like you or me, or
It's like completely unaware that it's a monster kind of thing.
yeah. And like, as far as it knows, it's just exploring, like it's just having a good
Right.
time. And there's the very creepy, like, we're going on an adventure phrase that like we make jokes about, but like in this creature's mind, that's really what it's doing. It's just like, wow, there's like whole universes out there, and I want to know everything, and I want to be everything, and I'm so excited. And like every time I get into something new, I learn all of this new cool stuff, and I feel like I'm expanding. And it's like, obviously in a different mechanism, but like we as people are, generally really excited about that sort of thing as well, right? Like we're so stoked to have new experiences and new sensations and all of that sort of stuff. And I find myself like, I can't even, like, I am terrified of that thing, but I can't be mad at it. And I think a thing that culturally we're kind of trained for is the notion that in, any other thing in relation to us, that we are an important part of that relationship, even if that thing is trying to destroy us, it hates us, or it wants to be our friend. In whatever scenario, we are an important part of that equation. Whereas as far as this creature is concerned, like we're just the like dust and debris of the universe. And there's really like no thought to like, do these people want me to be doing this? It's just complete indifference. And I find myself personally, like when I get the most freaked out in a story, that is something like that is where it always happens for me.
Yeah, and I like this because it'll partly set up some of the stuff we're going to talk about with the content for next time. But I like that it sort of it piques the idea that we have laid out that like uplifting and evolution and this kind of stuff is heavily centered around curiosity. We talked about how the point with uplifting the Octos was not just to make them smarter, but was to make them sort of a little bit even more curious, but they already are very naturally curious. But like we saw, I think back in book 1, that like increased curiosity, right? That like in the balance in an organism between attraction and aversion, it's sort of turning up the attraction, turning down the aversion a little bit. And the creature from Nod is just like that cranked up to 1,000, right? It's pure id, pure curiosity, zero boundaries, zero sort of understanding of being averse to something, even things that it hates, like being inside of a human. It still sort of groks it as this like cherished adventure, and then is so excited when its world opens up. But it really is that kind of child mind like creature, which is often scarier, right, than the like fully realized malevolent entity.
And so how all of this ends up coming together actually popped into my head while you were talking is, so one of the scenes that we had previous is where Paul and the human Portiad folks meet, and they're like trying to figure out how to communicate with each other. And Paul has this moment of like, is this tablet that's flashing colors at me the sentient thing? Is this like fleshy meat bag thing that I don't really understand a sentient being? Like, what's the deal with that? And they end up communicating together, and they end up, Paul is like very excited to be an ambassador because he volunteered for it. And then once he starts to kind of start to get humans, it becomes the thing that everyone else expects him to do. And then he's unhappy about it, which is very funny to me. And at some point they come together and realize that like the octopuses that he is with get the news that like this really terrible stuff has gone down planet side, and the humans start to get it, and they kind of meet up, and we have another kind of tense moment where they're like, are we going to destroy each other? Are we going to destroy each other? Yeah, and then they don't.
It's true of like pretty much every situation with the octos, right? Like it really highlights the downside of the octos as a species. It's hard to do game theory with them because they just aren't playing. They're just like there's not a rule to be followed in their minds in this kind of sense, and like not even a strategy, right? Like even if they were like consistently reliable cheaters, you could at least predict their behavior. But like the reoccurring theme is mid negotiations, one octo just turns on the other because they decided actually this is a bad idea, or they start fighting between each other, or like they get into big debates and stuff. I love the part where one of them humans is describing like trying to communicate with an octo, and like she can barely manage to have a conversation almost with one of them, but as soon as another one shows up, she's totally lost because they just lose it.
Yeah, and that was they had started to kind of get along with Paul a little bit, and then some of the other ones show up, and that like throws a wrench into things. And it's that
was the ice ball thing that we described last time, where they get frozen and carried off essentially.
Yeah, and it's so the way that they talk about how octopus culture works, because we had a little bit of it in the last section. We get a little bit more in this section too. Where like the humans start to understand the octopuses a little bit, and then they're just like, like whatever they're about, they are about it. There's just like no guarantee of how long that's gonna last, because they tend to follow like whoever is the loudest and whoever is the most confident and whoever is the most like bombastic about like whatever they're about. And then folks tend to just be like, well, I guess that makes sense to me. Which is sadly the piece where my, the fact that I feel like I have much deeply in common with our octopus friends leaves, because that terrifies me. But it does crucially, like in contrast to my feelings about the previous book, it does feel like the octopus culture feels, it makes sense. The stuff that it shares with like what's recognizably our culture and the ways that it departs, I think feel a lot more real to me in that, like, there are certain things that make sense that they have in common, where the spiders, I was like, oh, that just feels like
a little too human-y.
Yeah, like watching the news, like.
Right. Well, I do love that, both the octos and the creature from Nod are a more significant, sort of departure from not just kind of human consciousness, but human culture, society, all the kinds of things. And like from a plot perspective, why this kind of unreliability of the octos matters is the human, ported alliance quickly figures out that there's nothing to be done with negotiating with this species. Like, they can't communicate enough to have a conversation. They've now hijacked 2 of their people and kidnapped them. And what they've figured out is that like these creatures are really worried about the other planet. And I think basically the middle plot of this story is we're going to go find out like what is on that planet that they're so worried about, and maybe we can use that as leverage to get our people back or something like that. And that's like the second thing that I really, really wanted to talk about, how much I loved, where the scenes where they're figuring out what's happening on this planet, and they start to actually see the creature in action. So, they like send drones down to the planet or whatever, so they've got like camera views to see what's going on, and they discover what looks to be like a human city that hadn't been there previously. And they're, they describe the ocean waves, and you can see just like there's something else in the water that is not water, but kind of like mixed in together with it. And then there's an incredible scene where they describe there's like an insect from Kern's world that just like pulls together like detritus from the world around it to create a shell for itself. And they describe this as being a version of that, where it's vaguely human shaped, but it doesn't really move in a recognizably human way. And there's a line in particular where they talk about, it's one of the spiders like doesn't have an uncanny valley for something that like looks vaguely human, but it's still unsettling, because of like how weird it looks. And in particular, they
talk about because it's like a person in a spacesuit, because of course that's how the creature interacted with humans the first time, as they were wearing these like spacesuits. And they talk about there's like a polished stone that's where the visor would be, and the creature actually like looks up at the drones as if this is actually the creature's eyes. And it's just I went back and listened through this portion of the book a second time, finished like 5 minutes before we got on the record. And so that's just like, that's very fresh in my mind. That whole section of the book is so, I don't know that I've ever been like, felt really like unsettled or like disturbed by a thing that I've read as much as that. It's just so, ugh.
Yeah. It's there's a lot of good things going on there. This actually is one of the cases where our highlights overlap, because the creature's fake city to me was one of the like greatest moments of this book. There's other cool stuff about like the creature interacting with plants around it and stuff, but it really is like the city that sells it for a couple of things, a couple of reasons. You know, the first that occurs to me is that it's a reiteration of that like form but not function, surface but not depth kind of thing that we were talking about previously, with the way that people, you know, some entities could just be reading the surface level of creatures and not paying attention to their depth. Like, it's an entity that's a mimic. It's a pure mimic, but it doesn't know why it's doing certain behaviors. And it's in this way very human. Humans are, well, you know, the humans are expert mimics. That's our evolutionary adaptation. We talked about this before, I think, right? And like, you know, we will do a bunch of weird ritualistic behaviors that we don't understand if we see something like us doing them. So, you know, it is like us in that way, again, turned up to the nth degree. And so, it, you know, that's the great thing. That's one of the things that makes it horrifying, right? It's the classic, you know, John Carpenter line that the monster is just always us with funny hats on. The creature from Nod is very much like an us with funny hats on, and literally, you know, like you know, it's putting a weird rock in its head for a funny hat. But it's also, you know,
it's like one of the funniest parts of Hitchhiker's Guide, right? Got to build an interspace bypass. Why? Well, you got to build bypasses.
Yeah. The other thing I like about it is that it's a very pure Lovecraftian kind of creature in my mind, in the sense that it is this kind of childlike other, like the god Azathoth. It's sort of mindless in this way and playing, but could destroy everything without even realizing that it's doing so. But it also, you know, besides being a kind of gooey, sloppy mess, the city part reminds me specifically of what they call weird spaces, which show up in Lovecraftian literature, which are like areas that the normal rules of, you know, human values don't apply, essentially, that like they are governed by some alien other. And the city, you know, the fake city with like the walls but no entrance kind of stuff, that really rings to me. It reminds me so much of the cities that Lovecraft describes in these various ancient places kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think it really evokes, like, it's an uncanny valley experience, not just for a person or a face, but for a space itself.
Damn. Yeah, that's good. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I mean, that probably explains a lot about why it made me feel the way that it did. Because like a thing about the way that my brain works, and I know this isn't how everyone thinks, but like I have a very, very clear internal monologue, and I also have a really, really clear internal like movie projector. Like I really do like see pictures of things in my head as I am reading about them. The way that it's written is so like I'm literally there, like walking through these abandoned streets, like very curious about how like I'm on an alien planet. Why is there like a recognizably human city around me? You know, we've seen things like that in Star Trek too before, and that freaks me out. It's a lot. And,
it reminds me a lot of the city in the story, The Mountains of Madness, which is one of Lovecraft's sort of most developed pieces, which is in some ways connected to what the piece we'll be talking about next time as well. A lot of overlaps there. But yeah, it heightens the fact that it's on this foreign planet, right? And it's sort of, you have that first moment of horror when you're seeing something incomprehensible, and then your second moment of horror when you figure out what's causing it, but what's causing it is deeply inhuman, but is creepily mimicking human behavior in this way.
And then so how everyone ends up coming together is there's a confrontation where the octopuses are just like, we're gonna nuke everything and everyone in proximity, because they have learned that there's actually a really great way that they explain it as things are breaking down on their planet, where they're like, if one's infected, more's infected. If more's infected, all's infected. Something along those lines. And so they very much, they're doing the thing that like we end up seeing in zombie movies. It's like we actually have to err on the side of killing everyone, because even one individual is like, it screws up the whole thing. And so
it's very
like,
World War Z that way.
Yeah. And so the octopuses get together and they're, doing their thing, and the humans are doing their thing. And at some point we reach an understanding. We get the humans and the Portiids reach a sort of détente with the creature, because the creature has this realization.
Yeah, and this is my favorite moment in this book that really sold it for me, so what happens, as I understand it, is the Voyager team, I think they're called the Voyager, right? Is that the name of the ship, I think?
I think that's right.
Yeah, which I feel like the fact we haven't pointed that out yet is a failure on both of our parts, I feel like.
That is, yeah.
So they go to the space station of the former octo scientists, who are the people who had gone to study the alien at the beginning, way back when. And on that station is where the creature is like locked, is trapped essentially. And they get locked in a room with it. The guy gets locked in a room with it. It takes him over and takes over the implant. And then we get the final fight, or as Kern puts it, throwing down with it, philosophically at least. Basically, Kern realizes that the only solution is to convince this alien thing that it doesn't want to eat everybody, essentially. And she accomplishes that in a really cool way, which is an accelerated fictional VR experience. Where she essentially lets the creature win and see what that looks like for itself. And what that looks like is it takes over the whole universe, and then it's bored. Like it doesn't have anything to do, no more novelty to capture or anything like that. So, the child creature becomes very miserable at that point. And that's when Kern steps in and teaches it a little bit of self-control, right? And helps it understand that if it resists the urge to completely absorb everything around it, then it can continue to have friends to play with instead of just toys to play with.
Which is so framing it as a childlike entity that just has like way more power. It's very funny putting it that way, because I immediately, like when you're explaining that, I thought about the conversation that I feel like every parent ends up having with a kid. It's like, well, if you don't let anyone else play with your toys, like, you're just going to be surrounded by a bunch of toys. You're going to have nobody to play with. You're going to be bored and you're going to be sad. And that's essentially it's that conversation, but with, of course, much higher stakes, right? Which is just very funny to me.
Yeah, and it's interesting in those situations. Often, human psychology, one of the key milestones is the differentiation of the self, where the individual is old enough to start seeing themselves as a separate entity. And the way that they assert that usually is by saying no a lot. So when you think of the Terrible Twos, that's the assertion of the independent self in this way. And it, is that like, I don't want to play with you, or I don't want to, leave me alone. Like I'm a separate being with my own will and pleasure and stuff. The creature from Nod would never have that experience. It wouldn't know what any of that feels like. So it wouldn't, it would have to go through something, before it could realize that it needs to like get over that, like get to the next stage of interacting with others being a kind of end in itself.
Yeah, and I don't remember if it's specifically in this portion, but somewhere in this vicinity, as they're like exchanging understandings about each other, we actually get a pretty good explanation of how the phenomenon of understandings actually works. And how those understandings are transmitted from being to being. And it's like all of the information of everything is contained in a single cell. And so it was basically the way they explained it is if you like remove a single cell from a being and cultivate it, it will eventually like sprout a civilization again because all of that information is there. And that's, I just felt the need to give that an honorable mention because that is so freaking cool. Like that kind of world building. That's just, it's mind blowing because I think until then we had just kind of, like we'd known that was a thing, but I don't think we had gotten any explanation for the mechanism of it. So that other than like they're just genetically passed from generation to generation.
Yeah, well, and it's still not clear that we have a complete understanding of understandings in the sense because
right.
It doesn't seem to be true that like our cells work the way that the Nod creatures' cells work. Like I don't think it's the case that all of the information is captured in every single cell in that way. So that is a unique evolutionary trait of that creature as far as I'm concerned, which makes it's interesting that the virus, the uplifting virus, also creates the ability to pass on understandings and that they work in a similar kind of way, given that they arise separately. We have, as far as we know, there's no connection between the uplifting virus and the creature from Nod. So it's an interesting sort of separate, evolutionary tracks that are taking advantage of a similar feature in a cell or something like that, it seems like. And so you have to assume that like the claim is that like that's possible for everyone in the universe or something.
Yeah. Well, and there's a really interesting sort of gender politics moment as they're figuring all of this out, where one of the spiders, like, she's a little humbled by that because she is used to thinking of herself as like, the apex of evolution as it's happened so far, and she has to be reminded that like, no, the reason we work that way is because another being like shot us with a virus and made us like that it didn't happen just as a logical consequence of the machinations of the universe, but like this other creature that is how that worked. It like at least as far as we know. I guess we don't really know anything about this creature's origin, so maybe aside from the fact that at least as the narrative goes now, this is an independently evolved organism. It doesn't have anything to do like the Portiids or the octopuses with the uplift virus or humanity or anything like that.
Dumb biological luck.
Right.
But arguably, like, the Portid should recognize that, even if this entity has superior abilities in some sense, it lacks other crucial abilities. As a pure mimic, it can't do creativity or originality or novelty itself. It can't be a source of anything. It can only be a vessel for other things. So the generative ability of the Portid mind is still sort of different and unique in that kind of way.
Well, I'm sure our Portiid friends will be grateful for your affirmation of their specialness.
Look, I'm not just defending them because they're sexy, all right? I actually think that there's a separate value, that I'm not just saying they're smart because of that. I do think really they are, smart as ends in themselves and such things. Before we get over to the philosophy, there is a minor fifth highlight that I just have to toss out here. It's not a deep one. It's not that important, but I just have to mention that there is an Octo ambassador in this book named Ahab, and I simply cannot with how good that is. That is,
well, that
so
and an Octo that leads people into salvation named Noah. That's also very good.
Super, super great. Okay, shall we maybe do a little subtext then?
Yeah, I'm into it.
All right, let's grok it. My setup for this whole idea was kind of the duality of separate versus unity. And we talked about kind of the problem of separateness in part one. And we talked about language and the way that like different minds communicate and how radically different minds could struggle to connect in part two. And now I kind of want to talk about the problem of unity. because I think it's intuitively appealing to us that, like, hey, we could just solve all of our problems, by just being one entity, right? All just coming together as one, if we do enough mushrooms and just experience universal consciousness together, become one with the mycelium network, then we're great, right? But I think that there are a lot of things that are actually really valuable that, if you think about it for half a second, either don't make any sense or become impossible or become a lot less fun in a world in which there's only one mind. So I thought what we could do is we could start by just kind of talking through the list of things and think about whether that kind of life would be worthwhile, because that's sort of the argument that Kern raises, is like, if there's no other entities but you, a bunch of things are impossible and you don't want that. So I had suggested that you, ahead of time, we would both sort of make a list of things that we thought of that we, could either be impossible or less fun in the universe where the creature from Nod gets what it wants. So I'm curious, do you want to start with some of your list? I don't know if to share all of the list at once or not, but what were the things that immediately came to mind for you?
So my problem is I legit spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I might have been overthinking it, but I was kind of able to undermine every example I could think of. Because I can find a lot of value in solitude. I can find a lot of value in like group collective experiences. But the thing that I kept coming back to is that going back to the topic of the last episode, I don't know what it's like to be part of a collective consciousness. And so it's a little tough for me to say, to predict with what I feel like would be any kind of accuracy about like what it would feel like to do that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like for an example, I went to a concert last night, one of my favorite bands. And my initial thing is that like, one of the fun things about a concert is experiencing it with other people in a room with other people who are like, they love the music in the same way that you do, maybe differently, but it's like, this music all evokes feelings for us and we love it, maybe in different ways, but we all love it. And we have this like shared connection with it. And like we're getting rowdy and we're singing along and we're having a good time. And then I think about like, okay, well, if it's, and maybe this is oversimplifying it, but if we were all part of a hive mind having the exact same collective experience, I feel like that would lessen it a little bit. But then again, maybe not, right? Like maybe there would be a heightening of that feeling of collective euphoria or, togetherness, like having that same experience together. And again, going back to the same, to the topic from last time, like you could probably make a solid argument that there is a form of like collective consciousness at play where, elements of our individuality already do kind of fade out when we're having a really specific experience like that, going to a concert, seeing a band, all hearing the same songs. And so I just like, every time I could think of an example, I would come back to, but I could see maybe being part of a collective consciousness might actually heighten that feeling in a way. So yeah, for me, it's just a big old question mark. And, maybe there's stuff that I'm missing. Maybe I'm like overcomplicating it. I don't know. But like, I couldn't find anything. And I was actually a little more than disturbed by this. Like
the fact that,
every time I could think of an example, I could think of like really good reasons to feel at least super unsure about it. So,
okay, well, I've got a good list, so
thoughts.
we can certainly, I can give you some things, and this will be a good contrast. But before we do, I do want to back you up there on the like cultural consciousness stuff. There's actually
Yeah.
a specific term that comes to mind in what you were describing. It's called collective effervescence. This was a concept coined by the sociologist Emil Durkheim, and it sort of refers to the kind of collective experience that people can have, often in ritual states of a kind of unified consciousness. You know, I think one way to think of this that's not supernatural is just to say, you know, we understand the concept of a flow state where an individual sort of loses their sense of self in an event or an activity, and that group versions of a flow state seem very plausible to me, where lots of individuals experience that in a space together, in a unified activity in a way that gives that kind of sense of interconnectedness. So I do think there's something to that. Now, I think what's, you know, to highlight what you were saying about how we don't really know what this is like, one thing that I think is tricky is in our minds, I think we always trick ourselves into thinking of it as like separate entities in a collective consciousness. You know, that it's like...
I actually had that exact same thought as you were saying. Now I realize that's probably what I was doing there.
Right, and there's a difference, you know, and I say this partly because I've been watching a lot of Sense8 recently, and I've been messaging about the very after dark sequences in Sense8, which often involve a bunch of individuals who are connected through their consciousness, but are still separate entities. And that's a very different group activity than one where we're like, literally, we all just become this thing that calls itself we or they, or, you know, we and as they or something, or whatever, you know, like the plurals,
right.
In that kind of way.
And my thing is, like, you know, if we're talking about the idea of enjoying a thing more as like a solitary thing or a group activity thing, because I think as social a person as I am, as an extrovert as I am, I still do find moments of solitude like really, really recharging and and peaceful and wonderful. But like, if we really are a fully collective consciousness, like, I don't know that precludes that, right? Because we are all one thing. And
correct, yeah.
So if we're one thing, we're like, it's part of it, I feel like, is just like, it's so far out of my ability to imagine, because I'm like, it would be like being alone and in a room full of thousands of people all at the same time. And like, that just doesn't make sense to me. Like, I can't really like compute that.
Yeah, and I think we have to be careful, not thousands of people, but thousands of you, and they're not even
well,
separate,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
It's just you're in a room made of you, surrounded by everything that's made of you.
Yeah.
So like, here are the sort of things that I think, you know, if we really take seriously this idea of a unified singular consciousness being the whole universe, here's what seems straight up impossible to me. First of all, as cited in the book, experiencing the novelty of ideas and behavior generated by another mind. So, you know, when I'm having, so for example, dialogue becomes impossible in this context because, you know, I can have a monologue where I play both parts or something like that, but I can't have a situation where I hear something come out of you that is totally separate than what I was thinking, and that, you know, kind of drives me in a different direction in that kind of way. There's no ability for that to happen anymore.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I guess I was not quite thinking of it in terms of like, you know, being, you know, like everything in the universe being a part of a thing, right? Because what I think about is like, say for example, you know, the creature from Nod, whatever. And of course, you know, the idea of it sort of like exponentially expanding makes it becoming the entire universe pretty plausible. But you know what, I'm thinking more on a smaller scale, like if it was, you know, all of a sudden, like all of the humans on Earth, for example, right?
Became collected.
There's still, well, there's still plenty outside of that, right? That whatever that version of collective consciousness has, there would still be a sense of novelty in like going to another planet or whatever. And in fact, I might even argue that like, if we are all part of a collective consciousness and a few like fleshy meat sacks get to another planet, then that means people left back here get to experience that too. And so there's a way that it could heighten that sort of like novelty experience, in that, you know, whatever fleshy meat sack you're in wouldn't actually have to be physically a part of the thing for you to benefit from it.
Right. I agree. If you're just one hive in a universe full of other entities, that's a different conversation. I had sort of been specifically thinking about, like, what if the creature from Nod gets what it wants and really does absorb the entire universe in this way? What is the thing that Kern is threatening it with? Like, what is the bad time that it is being threatened with in this particular context? And I do think in that situation, yeah, you'd have solitude, right? But you wouldn't have novelty. That's the first thing that she scares it with, because that's what it cares the most about. Other things you couldn't, in theory, have if there were no other minds would be empathy, because that requires being able to make sense of what's going on in another being's mind without actually knowing what's going on in another being's mind. You're kind of empathically intuiting it in that kind of way. You wouldn't have, the ability to experience uncertainty about what other beings are thinking, which is actually a key component for a bunch of activities that we really enjoy doing. If you know whatever, like, this is similar to the problem of psychics, right? If you really are, a Professor X, besides just having to hear everybody's thoughts all of the time, you also, a lot of activities become a lot less fun. Poker, games become a lot less fun when you can just tell what everybody's thinking the whole time. Another one that came to mind for me was, both broadly speaking and a couple of really specific examples, developing caring reciprocal relationships with other autonomous agents. This goes to the idea of care ethics, which, they argue that, like, one of the pretty crucial pieces of a life of flourishing, maybe not for literally everybody, but I think for a lot of us, is the ability to have a reciprocal caring relationship with someone who, like, chooses to take care of you and you choose to take care of them, even though you are separate entities with separate wants and needs and that kind of thing. Like, that is arguably a cornerstone of a good life, essentially. And you wouldn't be able to have that here because it's just you pretending to care about you in that kind of way. Like the most depressing tea party you could ever imagine. And then there's some specific activities. Go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking about, because the way that you're framing it is obviously, like, the end game, if the creature from Nod gets everything that it wants, right? It is eventually able to do this just, like, absorbing thing of literally the entire universe all over the place. And I think, the thing that I'm trying to figure out is where would its limits be, right? Like, would it be able to expand itself outside of our galaxy, for example? Like, would it be able to make it through the entirety of the universe? Because I think about the scale that the universe exists on, even if this thing is exponentially expanding through everything that it finds, maybe this is just the wrong question to be asking, but I'm just thinking about how what eventually means that this creature can't have those experiences is that it literally becomes everything in the universe. But on the time scale that the universe has left to exist, like, do we actually think that it would get there? Because I think these things all
does it beat the heat death of the universe or something like that? Right? Can it race the heat death of the universe?
Right, because I think for a long time, this creature can actually have all of the experiences we're talking about, right? It's just that there's an expiration date on them. In theory, it will stop at some point.
I guess I would say, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was because that's why I think I'm having trouble with, like, I'm having trouble getting all the way there because
you're getting hung up on the physics of it, right? And, like, part of this for me is, like, this is obviously just a thought experiment to highlight why we want to be separate entities, not just trying to prove that the, like, creature should believe this, but if I wanted to game out the argument, we already know that by the end of this book, we find out that the octopi have created faster than light travel. Right. I love the description of this too. This is another one of my highlights from this book, is that they figured it out by just figuring out a way to squeeze through the holes in the universe. Like, it's literally their drive to escape, and they escaped the speed of light, like it was a cage. I love them so much.
Right. And I have to say, for me, it's not even necessary. I mean, the physics are part of it, but what I am thinking about is the way that the creature's experiences are described is that like all of the things that we're talking about that it will not be able to do if it reaches its end goal, while it's happening, I think those experiences that we're talking about are actually far greater than what like everyday people like us experience. And so for me, what I'm thinking about is that like, wow, like like the more I think about it, the more I am actually coming around to like, would it actually be that bad to be absorbed by this creature?
I'm actually pro nod.
And that's why I keep going down that path. It's not even necessarily just like the physical limitations of it. It's more that just like in the meantime, wow, would it be really cool?
Well, so that raises a really interesting thing, and this is a perfect example of like why dialogue is valuable, because I hadn't even thought to discuss this particular philosophical topic, but now that you've brought it up, you've really interestingly highlighted how the creature from Nod is a great example of a utility monster. So let me explain what that means real quick. That is actually a technical term. I did not make that up. That is a real thing. So a utility monster. A utility monster is a creature that has the ability to experience either more or better or different or higher kinds of pleasure than we can. And so the concern would be on a basic utilitarian view, where either you value quantity or quality, whatever you value. If there was an entity that could have more of that than other entities in some way, do we have an obligation to kind of shovel all of the utility that we can into that entity so that it can have those incredibly amazing experiences? Usually the answer is first, no, because then you're depriving everybody else of pleasure, which would be bad. But that's actually interestingly obviated if we are all being absorbed into the utility monster. If we're all becoming part of the utility monster, is that a bad thing? Is an interesting question in itself. But there's also an objection that often gets raised, which is there's no such thing as utility monsters, because you can't have an entity that could do this kind of thing, that could have the more pleasure. One of the examples people got worried about recently was AI. It's like a utility monster, artificial intelligence. But I think the creature from Nod is a great organic example of it, like a potential utility monster. And what you're saying is you're like, feed me to the monster, I'm for it. I'm super into this, just diving into its mouth.
And to be clear, like I don't know that I'm all the way there, but I can see it, right? And I can see, thinking about it more, I could see myself getting to that place, which like as a very quick preview of book 3, we learn very early on in book 3 that that's actually kind of what ends up happening, is that like the creature from Nod realizes that like, I'm not going to absorb anyone without their consent. But like knowing what it is, there are people who actually choose to do that because they want to preserve some piece of themselves. They want to there are people who proactively choose to do that. And that's actually kind of what got me thinking about it, because I was like, wow, that's like, I have a very immediate kind of like visceral like horror reaction to it. But the more I think about it, the more I'm just like, God, I don't know. Like, and you've ruined me is what it comes down to, Aaron. Yeah.
I mean, that's not unlike, it's pretty standard. It's surprising it took this long, to be honest. That being said, like there's a couple of factors in there that make that particular version less horrifying, but I don't want to give anything away from book 3 yet.
Yeah.
But like, I get what you're saying, that like there is something, let me put it this way. I don't think that the creature from Nod actually is a monster, right? I just think that it's a child with too much power. It's a kid with a gun, not a monster. And that its pleasure is really unique and valuable. And so that like it is an incredibly unique creature that is very important and should be preserved in this kind of way and not nuked off the planet by the octopi. But I do also think that Kern's concern is legitimate, and that it makes sense that it does actually work and sort of stops the creature in its tracks. Because, like, let's just imagine if we as humans didn't have separateness in this kind of way between each other. The list of things that I came up with besides the ones I already described that go away as far as I can tell. Language. There's actually a really interesting debate about whether you can have a language with just one person, a private language, if it's called.
Interesting.
You might think that you can, but you certainly can't have a language that involves other people in the sense. We already talked about dialogue. Interestingly, you can't have comedy, as far as I could tell. because comedy, I think, involves surprise of some sort, generally speaking, or in some way a kind of novel construction that, you can't play on yourself in a kind. Maybe there's some, I take that back. There may be some kinds of comedy that you could manage, but they're not going to be like really good comedy, I think. That involves sort of surprise, exaggeration, and juxtaposition and things like that. Lying, obviously, is another one that's off the table here, which maybe that's good. Maybe we're pro that. But it also means that trust is off the table. There's no trust in the universe of Nod, because trust requires not knowing what's going on in someone else's mind and having to believe them when they say what they are believing.
Yeah, and that's, again, this is a "you have ruined me" moment, because the thing that I come back to when you say that is, I'm like, okay, but is that a bad thing?
All right. Now that Callie is the creature from Nod, here's my sell. Here's my argument for why Callie wouldn't want this. Okay. Do you know the term mudita? We talked about this before, I think, maybe, when we talked about polyamory and things like that. This is I think it's a Sanskrit term, or I think it's Sanskrit. I apologize if I'm wrong on that. But the translation would be something like sympathetic joy. Taking joy in the joy of other people being happy.
Oh, yeah.
Taking pleasure in other people's happiness in that kind of
compersion
sense.
is the word I know for that.
Compersion, yes. Compersion is the modern term that people use for this same idea. There's no sympathetic joy without separateness. I think that, like, sympathetic joy is really crucial to a life of flourishing. Like, think about, all the times where it's not just you enjoying something, it's you getting to enjoy somebody else enjoying something. Like when you show them a movie for the first time, and they get to experience that surprise or joy or whatever, that kind of thing. So again, you could live without it, right? And maybe it would still be a good life in other ways, but I would consider that a pretty substantial loss.
Yeah, I don't really have an argument for that one. I agree. That is a significant portion of my life is just taking joy in other people being happy and having a good time. So yeah, I don't have a comeback for that one. You're right.
I knew where the sweet spot was. The other ones, that came to mind were things like keeping secrets, which, I think there's sometimes something, connecting, valuing, and sharing a secret, but also like sharing references, right? You and I realizing that we've both watched a bunch of Letterkenny is a pleasurable experience that can't happen if we all just have all the same references and we know it. Dramatic irony, right? So some kinds of art stick around, I think, but some parts of art go away. So you can't have basically, essentially the things that are made possible by the stage of childhood development when you realize that other people have different information than you. Like, you don't have those experiences anymore. There's no hiding behind curtains and panto or anything like that. And there's also no surprise parties, right? There's no harmful conspiracies, but there's no benevolent ones either.
Right.
So those all kind of just go out the window entirely.
Because thinking about, when you say secrets, like, it's easy, like, for your brain to go to a negative place with that, because obviously sometimes that's harmful, but there is something valuable in having just like having a level of privacy. Like, not everyone knows everything about me, and that's fine. I value that to some degree. I personally probably don't value it as much as other people do. I'd say a solid like 96% of my life I really just don't care to share with anyone around me. That's valuable, but like secretly plotting something to bring someone joy, that's a thing. Boy, do I struggle with that. I actually really have a hard time with deception of almost any kind, unless it is very directly like, you're a Nazi and I'm tricking you into like doing something that hurts you. Like, I have no problems with that. But outside of something that very explicit, I really have a trouble with anything that looks like deception. Even when it's like, I'm making a cool Christmas present for my friend, I find it impossible to just to like not share any details or to not spoil the surprise or anything, because I'm just like so excited to share this thing with other people. So yeah,
I'm not the
that
best
is
liar in the world, but I don't have that problem. I can certainly lie when I need to. I can
yeah.
certainly keep secrets when I need to.
Well, to be clear, if it's a secret, like you shared something
Sure.
deeply personal with me that like you trusted me with and you wanted
Right,
to stay
right,
private, that is not a thing I struggle with. But
right. I
if
understand
it's
what you mean.
and for me, it's not even like I feel like I have the social skills that I could probably pull it off. I think for me, it just causes me really, really deep anxiety.
Yeah, no, I can
'Cause
understand
yeah,
that. I don't love doing it, and like it's I find that like most of the time I'll pick just telling the truth because it just seems more functional.
yeah,
But I do think we talked about this in the previous episode that like privacy is a good to some extent, that there is something nice about having your own little world a little bit, your own internal island where you don't have to be accountable to anybody else in that kind of way.
right. But again, depending on what kind of collective consciousness we're talking about, like if we're the creature from Nod, then that's all we have, right?
Right.
If we're talking about like truly one collective entity,
There's no concept of privacy because there's
yeah,
nothing to keep anything from.
right.
Yeah, and I want to talk some about some of the ways in which this kind of gets cosmological, but I actually wanted to also mention some examples of things that I think don't become impossible, but they become way less fun if there's no other person there in this kind of sense. And they're, pretty much the things that make my life interesting, which is love, sex, art, and gaming. I think all of those, some version of them sticks around, but they become less meaningful, less valuable. Like you can love yourself and everybody loves themselves because they're all the creature from Nod at that point. But there's no experiencing love from someone, who is separate from you and could, withhold that love if they wanted to, which is a different kind of experience, I think.
It is. I do wonder though, there are a lot of ways that like we just as individual humans are like knowing deeper layers of ourselves throughout our entire lives, like even up into our like 70s, 80s, 90s, right? Like that if you want it to be, it can be a journey that lasts literally your entire life for decades and decades and decades until you die. And a thing that I do wonder is that in this example of the creature from Nod, right? Like would that dynamic unlock deeper layers of that like we as individuals now don't even have access to? And I don't know that I have any immediate thoughts about why the answer would be yes or no, but it's something that popped into my head to think about, that like there might be like a deeper level of experience there that we can't fathom because of the nature of the way that we move through the world, that we might experience on the other side of that.
I mean,
That's an interesting
absolutely.
thought.
Yeah, and in a sense, if we see the creature from Nod as being a benevolent child mind in this kind of way, it really is the pure sort of embodiment of like Buddhist enlightenment in the sense of, love is recognizing non-duality to the point where you are just, connected to the universe and like everyone is connected and we all love each other because there's no separateness. Like separateness is the opposite of love. It is an argument that like Buddhists will make, and we have this illusion that we think that we have to be separate to love. But yeah, I think there is a sense in which what they're looking for is what the creature from Nod is kind of offering. I'm not sure I totally agree, but I do think that like there could be a kind of sense in which like this being is literally a being of love. It's pure love. That's all it does.
Yeah, and that's what makes it hard, right? Because the idea is so appealing to gain that much knowledge and experience all at once, because it's a thing that we spend our lives trying to do, and realizing that on the scale of like the time that we exist versus the scale of the universe, like we know that there's no way that we are ever going to run out of questions to ask or mysteries to solve or like things to understand. Like at the scale that is presently possible, that's just never a thing that's going to happen. And I think maybe what I'm doing in like giving into the idea is like maybe prioritizing that feeling and that longing that's like, there's probably some really cool stuff going on in another galaxy that I'm just literally never going to know about because like I as an individual am too small to ever get that experience. And the idea of being able to have that scale of experience and that scale of knowledge is so appealing to me. But I'm like deeply horrified by the fact that like, well, maybe you get that and then, you have until the heat death of the universe to never move beyond that.
Right. And yeah, I want to talk about that kind of stable state problem actually in a second. But I do think, other things of value, like to me, are projects of worth for my life. Gaming has been a thing in my life forever. And I think, deception is good in gaming. Like it's fun to, bluff and like play other people that way. And like, we should be able to enjoy that, and you wouldn't be able to have that, right? You would never the only kind of games you could play would be the solitaire kind of games or something, and you'd never be able to invent a new one or anything. Then you'd have like art, and here like similar, like art and education actually go together here for me, because I think both of them are about communication fundamentally, and like you and I have both talked about like the pleasure of the aha moment when you help someone else understand something or someone helps you understand something, and that light bulb goes on. You couldn't have that, right? In this situation, all education would be near instantaneous, and there would be no educators in that kind of sense. And there would be no art that's meant to convey information. So think about like Dear Sweet Paul, whose greatest joy in life is to do performance art and convey the meaning of a moment. All of that dancing becomes pointless, totally pointless.
Yeah. Oh, my sweet baby Paul. That makes me so sad to think about.
Right. Think about all the sympathetic joy that you experience watching Paul do his favorite dance. It's gone. It's all gone. It's gone forever.
It's true. Well, and I wonder, I'm thinking about the idea of creating art. And, you talked earlier about the creature being a mimic and not necessarily understanding why it's doing the things that it's doing. And it's just like doing them because that's the information that it is, the information and experience that it has absorbed. And I wonder if that is actually the case. And I ask that because what I think about is as you absorb all of that, at some point does something more than that emerge once you have absorbed that much information? And then are you then able to, even just like as a single collective entity, start actually doing generative art, coming up with stories of your own, that sort of thing? Because that's a thing that I can think of maybe reviving that sense of novelty in just like having the ability to imagine things and like work those things out. Like that feels at least feasible to me.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it's sort of complicated by the fact that the creature spends so much of the book not having absorbed more sophisticated or enough sophisticated entities, it feels like, to get there. But it does seem like you're right. If it has a species or two banging around inside of it, like that's enough content that it could, in theory, maybe just generate novel things through the recombination of old things, which is how we do it to some extent as well, obviously, sampling, as it were. So, yeah, I do think that's true. What I don't think you unfortunately get is the presentation, right? The prestige moment where the art is revealed to another entity, right? You can make art, and you're certainly right, you could make novel art in a sense, but no one else would ever be there to experience the novelty of it.
Yeah, and that's true. And I mean, I know artists who like make art, and like the making of the art is pleasurable in a very different way than it is pleasurable to absorb it when it's made by someone else. Right. Like I know a lot of people who write fanfic, and they will say that it's cool if other people enjoy it, but it is an enjoyable exercise that I do specifically for my own benefit because it's an exercise of my own imagination and the way things work out in the world. And like, if other people are into it, cool, but like, that's not why I do it. It's really an experience that's meant fully for me. But like, there are a lot of people who, like, I make art because I like the process of making art, and separately but equally as important is watching how it affects other people and how other people interact with it. And that would be a crucial loss for a person like that, for sure.
Yeah, I think so. Speaking specifically, actually, we recently were on another podcast talking about trans issues, and that was, a really enjoyable experience because I felt like we got to provide a lot of valuable information, and you just kind of don't get to do that. It's sort of like, it's the downside of, the Matrix version of like, I know Kung Fu. Sure, you now know Kung Fu, but you didn't get to enjoy being bad at Kung Fu and then getting better at Kung Fu. You
Right.
just got better. And so, like the journey is, valuable. I think process and product both matter in that kind of sense. Let me switch gears a little bit, unless you have something else you want to add there, and talk about like some of the like cosmological endgame of this to me, because you mentioned the idea of like, if you get to the point where the creature from Nod absorbs enough technology that it can outpace the growth of the universe somehow and literally absorbs the whole universe in that kind of way, does it reach a kind of stable state then where there's no more change in the universe? It's just a pure unchanging entity at that point. I think it would, maybe the thing you were saying about like the recombination internally would go on for some period of time, but on a long enough timeline, there's only so many recombinations. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not good at infinites, but I think
Right.
what was interesting to me about this is that the creature from Nod reflects several different cultures' versions of the kind of panpsychist Spinozan God that I talked about previously when we were discussing monads versus non-monads. Individually on a cell-like level, it sort of is monadic, but like there's a description in Hinduism of Brahman, of the kind of Godhead, as being a like perfect, unchanging being that is separate from the changing, flawed, fallen universe that we're all living in. And that kind of being is sort of what I imagine the being from Nod would end up looking like if it got its wish in that kind of way. It would become Brahman in that sense. But one of the real problems in Hindu philosophy of that sort that the Buddhists raise is if that's the being, if that's God, it can't interact with the world, because to interact with the world would be to change and would be to, be more than perfect and eternal in that kind of sense. And similarly, like with the being from Nod, right? It can't interact with something changing because it reaches that kind of stable state, and that seems bad. Like it seems like you wouldn't want that essentially. But I thought it was just fascinating that like this kind of weird, creature on a large enough scale ends up looking like God.
Yeah. And, as you were talking, I was also thinking about how, like, this is an obvious thing, but I think it makes sense to just state in the context of this discussion, is that like knowing a piece of information and knowing like the underlying mechanism of the universe that led to that reality are two very different things, right? So like you can know, for example, like I know that the sun is in the center of our solar system, and I know some things about how it operates, but that doesn't necessarily tell me why. Like, how did the star form? What are the like fundamental physics of the universe that make it operate the way that it does? And so on the one hand, I'm thinking, so, it becomes the entire universe. That doesn't necessarily mean that it automatically understands the underlying bits of how everything in the universe works. And so like what I was thinking about is like the possible novelty of like watching the universe develop over time and all of the like new and cool, interesting things that happen in the universe. But I also feel like, if you're absorbing all of these sentient creatures and all of this life, like I feel like you would kind of have to absorb that knowledge of like physics and how things work, such that like even as the universe changes, like you would be able to know, like you would essentially become God, right? Because you know everything about how the universe works, then like there's nothing that could surprise you. Like a star is going to be in existence over there in a billion years, and then it's been a billion years and there it is.
Well, and this raises a good point where it's like maybe the creature wouldn't actually need to absorb the whole universe to get bored. Like maybe that
Yeah.
there's a drop off point where yes, it's still experiencing new things, but they're not novel in any kind of way, right? It's just another copy of something it's seen 10,000 times in a bunch of other places. And so it starts hitting a point where there's just no new kinds of arrangements of experiences to be had long before, right, it manages to eclipse the entire universe. And that would still be a kind of hellish experience at that point, it seems like.
Well, yeah, I mean, it would almost be like, I hesitate to say this because I don't want it to sound trivializing, but I feel like it would end up maybe being psychologically damaging in the same way that like solitary confinement is for humans now,
yeah.
right? Like,
Absolutely.
because
I think you go insane.
Yeah, you're just completely cut off from anything in the environment that stimulates you in any way whatsoever. And yeah, that is terrifying.
Which is why this comes back to Lovecraft for me. Azathoth is the like godhead of the Lovecraftian universe. It's this being that sits at the middle of the universe and is described as this gibbering mass with like a child mind, and we're all sort of living in its dream, and if it wakes up we all get destroyed kind of thing. And the the Azathothian kind of creature, it doesn't have any will, it doesn't have any desires at any point or something like that. And it does seem like it's a kind of a hellish existence in itself, right? And that's what we would all kind of get sucked into in that kind of way.
Well, where we have come to is that I am now no longer stoked about the idea of being absorbed by the creature from Nod.
But I do think there's an idea of like, sometimes folks will say, we are in the mind of God or something like that, but we are God's ability to experience itself subjectively. That like maybe not the reason, but like when the 10,000 things arise out of the Tao, it allows for this intersubjective experience. And I think it's really fascinating that like on a very grand scale, just like humans are always wondering why is there something instead of nothing, we always are kind of fundamentally wondering why are there multiple things instead of just one thing? Like why isn't it just one unified universe? Why differentiate at all? And obviously there's physical answers to that. But I think on a philosophical level, I think we're always kind of hung up about that a little bit. And yeah, I think one of the, like, whether or not there's a reason for any of it, or if it's just all total random, chaos, like, I think that we can recognize that there's great value in that separate experience, even though it comes at a steep cost.
Yeah, and like I end up bringing everything back to Star Trek. I just keep thinking about, okay, so I would want to be a changeling, and I would want to be a part of the Great Link because you can kind of like jack in and jack out, and you can get like the benefits of all involved. That's the collective consciousness I want to join. I don't want to be part of the creature from now.
Right, and to not like spoil it or anything, like that'll be where the enthusiastic consent Nod creature is gonna head. But like yes. At the moment of crisis within this story, that doesn't seem like a live option. And like I feel a deep personal attachment to these kinds of metaphysics that. The Discordian view that sees the true underlying nature of the universe as chaos. And the other thing I wanted to mention about the Azathoth that I just remembered was it's described as not just childlike, but insane. So like the idea that it goes insane is interesting that you brought up that the creature from Nod would go insane if it achieved a kind of Azathoth-like state in that sense. But I often talk about the Discordian view of the world where the true underlying nature is radical chaos. And then we as sort of conscious beings apply, frames, they call them, to the world by which some things appear ordered and disordered. And it's always this attempt by us as sort of thinking beings to try to figure out, are we actually experiencing a differentiated world, or are we just creating the illusion of a differentiated world? And in doing so, we're creating all of this weird order and disorder and stuff like that. But that's just our weird mind trip and not anything out there in reality. That out there really is just the creature from Nod all the way down already.
Yeah. And how would we know, right? Like, how would we know?
Right.
Like, what would we see in the universe that would give us the answer to that question?
Right. How do we know? It's not just a creature mimicking. Well, Yeah, and I want to give away book 3 stuff as well, but like also that is kind of like a weird concern, almost like a simulation theory problem where it's just like,
Yeah, I was
you know,
just thinking about that. Like, you'd have there people talk about that's people post those like weird social videos. It's like, oh, it's a glitch in the matrix. It's proof we're living in a simulation.
But you raise another issue that in theory people might think would be solved by getting rid of separateness, but I don't think actually would be, which is that problem of, do minds exist at all, that we've talked about before, this idea like, can I know that I actually am conscious, or do I just give myself the illusion of being conscious? So some people might think, well, the problem of knowing whether an AI is conscious or not. If I was the creature from Nod and I just absorbed the AI, I could know if it was conscious or not because I would find out. I would become one with it in that kind of way. It seems to me that could kind of remove that problem, like kind of chess playing AI problem, but it wouldn't remove the problem of whether we ourselves know whether we're conscious, which it seems like remains a kind of fundamentally unsolvable problem in a philosophical sense. All we can say is we have this very persistent experience, and it seems impossible to imagine that it's an illusion in any sense, that is actually meaningful, but who knows.
Yeah. What and I'm curious, I mean, talking about unsolvable sort of like philosophical questions. I'm also interested in like it is just an interesting question to me on its own to think about the question of like, how do I know that I am actually an individual mind? How do I know that like I as a mind exist? For me, like I'm very interested in rolling those questions over, like just because I like thinking about big questions, right? Like get high, watch Star Trek, and think about like theory of mind. And I know like obviously there are some of those things that have like very practical implications that like if we work out what the answers to those questions might be, it helps us like relate to one another better. It helps us like solve problems and that sort of stuff. But that's one that I feel like that question interests me, but I'm interested if you have a practical application for that question. Like what does it actually help us do IRL?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think first of all, it could psychologically, just meditating on this debate could help us feel less anxiety about our separateness, in the sense that like we could see it mentally as more of a good thing and less of a problem or something, and that could ease our concern there to some extent. So I think that could be a benefit. I also think there's an interesting argument being made here for a kind of weak standpoint epistemology. So the way that would play out would be like another thing that isn't possible with the creature from Nod is a kind of social learning model where you have a community of thinkers with differing viewpoints, and each of them is bringing sort of novel ideas, and we're collaborating in that kind of way. And, generally speaking, when people talk about like viewpoint diversity in a non BS kind of way, what they often mean is, people coming from different backgrounds, different experiences, having, looking at something with different eyes in that kind of sense. And so I think what we see in the argument against the creature from Nod is an argument in favor of diverse, viewpoint diversity in that kind of way. And this goes back to our discussion of like, I think I actually previewed this in one of the earlier episodes. There's a value to a human or octo or spider worldview unconsumed by the by the uniformity of the creature from Nod in this sense. Like even if the creature from Nod could absorb me and create a copy of me, that feels different. That entity is different in its abilities than I am. And I think that there would still be a value maintained in me being kept separate in that kind of way, for the continued expansion of knowledge, not just the having of experiences in that kind of sense. So that could be another practical application there, essentially reinforcing the need for standpoint, diversity over the super genius in isolation kind of model of understanding.
Yeah, I just think about, all respect to previous discussions aside, because this is not me coming back to around to like, yes, creature from Nod, absorb me, daddy. I'm not there, but I think, the argument could be made that, the idea of viewpoint diversity is, it's like trying to solve a particular problem that the creature from Nod simply doesn't have, right? Because
it just becomes omniscient already.
Exactly, right? So
Yeah. Well, so it's an interesting question. It goes back to this kind of idea of like, when we're doing standpoint epistemology, is there a kind of novelty that we can create as separate entities working together that couldn't be created by a single entity just recombining information in itself in this kind of way?
yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's an interesting question.
Because I'm thinking, like, on the one hand, there's the experiential, like, joy and happiness that comes from, like, making a connection and solving a problem when, somebody else comes to you with a viewpoint, a perspective that you'd not previously considered. And you're like, oh, wow, like that gives me the information that I need to at least get, like, closer to what feels like a solution to a problem. And, is the joy in that experience specifically because of the novelty and the connection with the other person, or is the joy primarily about like I'm so relieved and so happy that I have, like, something approximating a better solution to this problem? Because I feel like, it, in theory, I feel like it would solve if the joy comes from the thing that's just solving the problem, then that doesn't necessarily mean we can't do that anymore. But if it's specifically the idea, that the sort of, like, experiential, like you're deriving joy specifically from that, like, individual interaction across difference, then obviously, that remains a problem.
Yeah, well, another, like, related non-instrumental argument that you could put forward here. So you're right, the omniscience thing could solve the need for standpoint epistemology, but like we talked about previously, there might be something to the value of preserving cultural or species diversity, in a sense, that, like, the portids unmolested by human ideas are a different creature, and, like, there's some amount of cross-culture change that is inevitably going to happen when they interact, but there could be some amount of preservation of, like, ported ways and human ways, and that might not even be like we're doing that because we think that, like, that'll give us better knowledge or better understanding. We might actually just think, well, it's actually intrinsic, like the same way that I think it's valuable to have 10 different kinds of really pretty trees instead of just 9 kinds or something. Like, like, there's a value in having a bunch of different weird cultures and stuff out there that you can explore. And like having that replaced by the creature from Nod's, like, imagine, like, the creature from Nod creates It's a Small World at Disney, and it's just, like, horrible half-formed versions of every culture it's absorbed. Like, God, all of the beauty and, like, subtlety that it seems like would be lost in that situation.
Yeah. What in that, I mean, that makes me think about, like, power dynamics and motivations, right? Because I think the way those kinds of things often play out in our world is, the process when it is doing, when there's a positive version of that process, I feel like it often plays out in that, like, we will have these sorts of, like, cross-cultural understandings, and we will, like, move forward taking what seems to work the best for everyone and leave behind what seems to not work for folks. And that, like, when we come at it from different points of view, we can realize things that we didn't otherwise. But in the real world, the way that it tends to work out is the people with the most power get to decide what stays, and what stays is usually what serves them, not what serves, like, us as a whole. And so that's, maybe that's the bias that I'm bringing to that conversation, because I feel like if we're doing, because obviously when people talk about, like, in the real world, in IRL, when people talk about cultural preservation, it's usually like, what is it, the 14 words or something, like protecting a future for white children or whatever. Right. Like
or
that's
it's
usually
tokening, right? It's kind of like setting up human zoo kind of situations.
Right. It's the idea that, like, we're preserving our culture because other things are a threat, because racism, because xenophobia, because whatever, not because there's something, like, valuable and useful and meaningful that I want to hold on to, which in that sense, I'm, like, 100% for it. It's just that it's sad that in our world, that's not usually how it ends up working out.
No, I hear what you're saying. And actually, we're out of time, but this is a perfect setup for our preview for next week's content. Which you obviously planned totally, or we connected it, via our mental assimilation. Well, yeah. So like this problem of assimilationism, essentially, and I want to talk about assimilationism as a problem more. And we have a perfect piece for this, and hopefully a perfect special guest. So I won't announce the special guest just because I don't want to, spoil it in case it doesn't happen or something. But we are going to cover next week the piece called "The Thing" by Peter Watts. So folks will remember Peter Watts from his book Blind Sight, which is the other book besides Children of Time that an anthem that I try to pressure everyone in the world to read. And, he is the other person besides Adrian who I think is really crushing it or on the sci-fi philosophy of mind stuff. And I think when you read this story, you'll understand why I think it's a great complementary piece for what we just read. And I think highlights the kind of concerns that you're talking about really effectively. So I'm excited to talk about that next time. And I think that means it's time for you to thank some patrons.
It is time for me to thank some patrons. As Aaron mentioned at the top of the show, just moving right along in our patron drive, and it is very, very cool. I have a very tiny, cute doggo sleeping right next to me, and he's very excited to meet folks. And so, let's keep that rig rolling. So, shout out to our new mushrooms, Matthew Banks, Astro, and Kevin, and our new red shirts, Karen Parker and Vivian Imbriotis. I hope I said your name right. It's a very cool name. And then shout out to strong AI patrons. I got to say, unfortunately, Aaron, when you do this, you come up with really, really funny ways to expand the names of that's just a creativity that I don't have. So I apologize. I still love.
If you absorbed me, you could have it if you wanted.
Strong enough AI that it's too complicated to be absorbed into a collective consciousness, even by the creatures and non-patrons.
Look at you grow.
Randall Nelson Peterman, Corey Ebert, and I'm going to be high as a kite by then. Big Easy Blasphemy. Give to modestneeds.org. Then visit deepfakestop.com. A wise Zen once said, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." Jesse Rabinowitz and Brenda Goodman, Dude and Jesta, and are definitely not a clone. We're just the collective consciousness absorbing the universe patrons. Alex Benishik and yelling at podcasters is para-antisocial. Thank you for making all of this possible, friends. We deeply, deeply appreciate you.
See, if we weren't separate entities, I couldn't support you and thereby give you the confidence to do the thing. And with that, I think it's time for us to head on over to, I guess, the single entendres dimension. So those of you who are super tired with subtext and would like some hot, sweaty text, grab your altered state of choice and head to the highly suggestive looking portal over there. And the rest of you, thanks again for listening. And Callie, I believe the last word is yours.
Yeah, in After Dark, we often... it comes down to just like a story has unlocked a new kink for me. It was fascist fashion for Andor, and I've got something to talk about with this one. So let's head down to the cargo bay.
Thanks again to our listener units and patron units. Your support makes our internet broadcast possible. If you want to hear more from us, check out our other internet broadcasts, Queersplaining and Embrace the Void, as well as our wonderful editor Louisa Lyons filmed live musicals podcast. Leave them all 5-star ratings and reviews on your podcast application. You can follow us on Twitter at ZeroGPhilosophy or email us at philosophersinspace@gmail.com. If you want to support the show and get even more juicy sci-fi hot takes, consider joining the crew over at patreon.com/0G. Just $2 a month gets you early access to episodes and After Dark content. Until next time, friends, stay gooey.